Hello, welcome to Dirt Rich, seasonal conversations about food and farming. I'm Jared Luhman, the soil health lead for the Sustainable Farming Association, and today I'm talking to my coworker Tyler Carlson. Tyler is the Silvopasture and Agroforestry lead for the SFA, and he also owns and operates a farm with his wife. We're going to learn a little bit about what silvopasture is, its history, and how he and others are utilizing it on their operations today. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the interview. Well, welcome, Tyler. Thanks for taking some time to be on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So I'm excited to talk about this topic, silvopasture. It's a topic that a lot of people don't know a whole lot about. Would you mind by starting us off with just a brief description of what silvopasture even is?
Yeah, sure. The definition of silvopasture, in my mind, is the intentional integration of trees, forage, and livestock into one intensively managed system. So within that system, we're managing the trees, particularly managing specific trees in a wooded area or in an area where we're introducing trees into pasture to benefit the growth and performance of the pasture forage component as well as the livestock.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what did it look like, this integration that you talked about between animals and woodlands prior to, Midwest agriculture, European settlement? What was that like? Obviously, at that point, it wouldn't have been, domesticated livestock, but those native animals, how were they integrated with woodlands?
Yeah, the best example, of thinking about how humans, wild animals in that case, and woodlands interacted pre-European settlement was really the creation and maintenance of oak savannas. Oak savannas are a system that are largely very disturbance dependent system to maintain it in a balance between prairie and woodland. And so the use of fire by indigenous Americans to create that landscape for various uses and benefits and particularly for hunting and foraging practices and utility would have attracted a wide range of herbivorous mammals to those areas post burn by creating ideal conditions for lush and abundant nutritious forage, as well as shade and shelter for the times of year where wild animals and livestock alike benefit from that kind of shelter, whether it's shade during high heat of summer or winter shelter from winds and or driving rains and those kinds of winter adverse conditions.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's interesting thinking about, like you talk about the people who lived there and how they almost controlled it and it wasn't entirely natural. It was almost intentional at that time too, and that they recognized those benefits at the time. I know you touched on it a little bit, but what were the benefits that it
Yeah, I mean,
provided?
I think that the benefits almost, the benefits that would have been there for the wild animals and would have attracted the wild animals are similarly the benefits that humans are after. We're large mammals too. We benefit from shade. We like shelter, and we prefer our food to be close to those areas. And a savanna is kind of, if you think about it, at least the story of the out of Africa story is that we evolved on the steppes in the savanna of Africa and moved across, the rest of the planet from there. And everywhere we go, we see examples of different cultures and different places and different landscapes creating savanna-like conditions. We are attracted to a landscape that is sparsely populated by trees, easy to move through, easy to see a long distance for whether that's hunting or protecting from would-be invaders or whatnot. And then the diversity of the savanna provides for a lot of opportunities for direct consumption of fruits and nuts and herbs and roots, as well as the hunting and or trapping of the wild game that are similarly attracted to those landscapes for that reason. And so, it's kind of, the food is close, and a lot of the structural sort of features of a savanna-like landscape is enormously beneficial to people.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting. So if it is beneficial, and there's some people switching to that in kind of some ways now, what are but largely the landscapes we see in the Midwest now are either, cleared lands, entirely cleared, primarily put into row crops, cash
Right.
crop, corn and soybeans, or woodlands that otherwise, hunter would see and appreciate, but there's very little of this savanna, savanna. Um, well, first of all, why is that? I'm curious, like, why is there that separation? And then second question after that would be like, how are those still integrated today? Are they at all? And why are people doing it? And in what ways are they doing it?
Sure. Well, in the 1800s, the plains bison was nearly exterminated. So by the U.S. government, and we, as a result, lost a huge force on the land from the maintenance of savanna-like landscapes. And similarly, as Europeans, settled across North America, we also removed fire. We tended to fear fire and try to put fire out as much as possible, because fire is enormously destructive. We don't want to lose our houses, etc., and everything else that we build. And so, if you remove fire and one of the primary, large herbivores from the land, you're going to have a hard time maintaining savannas without some other intentional management tools that can drive those disturbance regimes and keep it from either basically losing the trees and going to open pasture, or then subsequently cropland, or going into an more overgrown state, shrub, brushland, or even more, advanced forest system. And so different ways that the savanna could shift and we lose the savanna ground. And then a reason why I would say we haven't integrated, that we have this separation of kind of like agriculture and forest and nothing in between, sort of, is somewhat related to, I would say, some silo effect in our university systems, our education systems around, how we produce food. And so food and farming is in its own it's in its own campus, it's in its own department, and it's separate from forestry. And so, you're focused on doing one thing when you're in those departments, and you do it well. You do it very well. But there's some benefits to the integration, and we've lost a lot on the landscape when it comes to wildlife and some of the environmental benefits of savanna-like landscapes. For particularly for environmental or habitat type benefits, which people need. And then I would say that also, until recently, we didn't have the kind of technology that's really required to do a good job with integrating livestock into forest systems, just like we didn't necessarily have it to do on prairies and open pastures. Mm-hmm. So the technological advancement in water and fencing systems has played a huge role in our ability to do targeted impacts in managing the impacts of livestock on the land, their grazing and their animal impact on grasslands, shrubs, trees, forage, etc.
Yeah. It's interesting, like, how you talked about the fire being like a tool, because I remember reading about that, where at some point, and I guess I don't know what department it was or whatever, they saw these wildfires and thought how destructive it is. And so they went out, tried to stop it. And what ended up happening was this huge landscape shift. The fires were instrumental in creating that certain habitat and keeping brush down that allowed, the overstory to let sunlight down to the grasses and different things. And when they stopped that wildfire, these other plants came in and eliminated that landscape altogether. It's fascinating. A simple act that you would look at it and you would say, this is destructive, this is terrible, we have to stop it, at first glance. But when you take into consideration its impact across the landscape and in that ecosystem, that was the most destructive thing they could have done, was stop that wildfire.
Yeah, certainly on some landscapes, the initial well-intentioned desire to stop fires from destroying that land or human settlements nearby, et cetera, houses, on some landscapes has led to the buildup of brush that at some point is going to burn. And when it does, it burns big. And that's, we're definitely seeing some evidence of that out west and up in, Canada. Not so much, I guess, yet in Minnesota, but yeah, we're seeing that in North America.
Interesting. So today then, how are people integrating livestock today, and does livestock work as that tool to keep down brush, or is fire still a tool that is valuable today?
Yeah, I think it depends on your goals, but in most situations today, the way that we see livestock integrated into woodlands is really it would just be called woodland grazing. I wouldn't describe it as silvopasture. It's generally just fencing in a wooded area that is not suitable for cropland. Typically, that's why it's in forest. And so, a farmer's just looking to get some extra pasture out of it. And it's probably been pastured for years and years, decades. And it can look somewhat savanna-like because a lot of the trees have died out, or the farmers harvested them for firewood, and other personal uses, or for sale, if there's decent trees in there for marketing. And so that's the primary way that we see it. It's generally low management. The animals are typically put in there for weeks or months at a time. And they're kind of left to their own devices in there.
What's the result of that?
The result is generally certainly a degraded woodland system, typically degraded soil, degraded habitat, degraded water quality. A lot of things that society is looking to do a better job of providing on our multifunctional landscapes. So yeah, and fire, most farmers are not using fire when they're integrating livestock. Fire in some systems might be being used, I would say, more like by public land, managers who are trying to utilize fire to particularly probably keep certain fire dependent plants or certain species that really need fire to regenerate and maintain themselves in the system. So fire has a role if that's part of your goal, but certainly livestock can keep livestock, in various forms of management can keep the brush down, so to speak, on their own without fire.
Okay. So that degradation, I'm curious on that degradation and the lack of management. What does proper management look like, and why does that change? Why is that different than improperly managed?
Yeah, sure. So I would say really similarly to when we think about grazing of even open pastures and open, grasslands, native grasslands or restored grasslands. We used to and still do a lot of basically putting animals onto a pasture for weeks to months at a time. But there's been decades of work recognizing the benefit of rotating and moving cattle, providing rest to those pastures and those plants. Not just benefits to the wildlife and the environment, but benefits to the farm operator too, the producer. We can provide a better, more consistent, profile of forage nutrition and availability or production across the season with rotational grazing. And really, the more intensive we get, so sure, moving cattle once a week is good. Moving them every 3 days is better, and moving them every day or even more than once a day is even better than that. There's diminishing returns with every move, but it just kind of depends on the producer goals and what the site is sort of asking for that would dictate how frequently animals are being moved. But by moving animals off, by coming in and taking a portion of the forage, not everything, but a portion, maybe up to half of the forage available, and then moving them off and allowing the site to rest for weeks to months before returning again for a short duration grazing event, we can maintain much healthier plant systems, plant root systems in particular, in those systems. And that's the same for open pasture as it is for a woodland system or a silvopasture system or a savanna. We're really looking to maintain some sort of balance between harvesting and, defoliating those plants without harming them, so that they can bounce back, they can have deep roots that, can reach deeper reserves of moisture, greater pools of nutrients. So these can reduce inputs. And also as a result of moving and resting, you reduce the congregation of livestock in any one spot for too long of a period, which when livestock, congregate in any one area, whether it's for a few days too long, or particularly weeks and months at a time, we have issues with nutrients and soil damage and things like that. So
yeah, that rest and recovery period is really important in the woodlands, the woodland areas, just as it is in open pasture land.
Yeah, and also important, not just for the plants and water, but also for any other wildlife you're trying to support in those systems. There needs to be something there. There needs to be some structure to support nesting areas and places of cover to hide, and places and other things that are out there to hunt and eat.
Yeah.
So we want to leave, if we want to get maximum and optimum multi-purpose benefit out of our working lands, we have to factor those things in.
Yeah, that's interesting, because a lot of people, and kind of where my next question was going, is the focus on the financial side and the financial benefits of silvopasture. But you mentioned the multifaceted benefits that come from this, as opposed to just the financial side. There's your wildlife species increases, the rest improves the grasses and the soils that will improve nutrient density and all these things in your soils and the products that you're raising. But on the financial side, like, what do you see as some of the biggest financial benefits of silvopasture? When I think of it, I right away think of some of my neighbor farms. They've purchased farms in the past that have 10 acres. One in particular, I'm thinking he bought a farm that's got like 10 or 20 acres of woods. And when he was buying it, he said, that land's worthless to me. I'm not going to pay, any price per acre, because to him that ground was worthless. And so I got to imagine if you can take what otherwise would be viewed as worthless land and turn it into some sort of praisable land, that's a huge financial benefit. You essentially just bought yourself more land, more usable land for free. Is that the main financial benefit, or are there other financial benefits too?
Yeah, one way to frame that is to think about, from a producer's perspective, they might ask, why would I want to have, pasture with trees in it? Why would I want to put shade on my, pasture plants, my grass for my cattle or whatever? And, in theory and in practice, when it's done right, there's a caveat, because these systems are highly diverse and complex and take a lot of management. But in theory, these systems have the capacity to outperform it from a financial perspective, a return on investment perspective, either wooded areas and open pasture ground. So because you're combining trees, particularly when you start managing that wooded system for high value timber, when you combine the benefits of the long-term sort of equity building of that timber that one day can be harvested, with the benefits of livestock gain, those systems can be more profitable than an open pasture system. Now, in the short term, a lot of producers that I'm working with, they're not necessarily interested in timber. Timber can be, particularly if the site doesn't have high quality timber now, or high trees that will be high quality timber soon, it can be decades before you'll get a harvest that can, bring in the thousands of dollars an acre that, we all
when the
hope
average
for.
farmland owner is 67 or something, they're not thinking about a 40-year return on their land.
It's for your that's for your grandkids, right? So that's a harder sell.
Yeah.
But it does factor in. But I would say that, so that's kind of a longer term outlook on that profitability. But in the short term, the benefits of silvopasture come, particularly when you compare to open pasture settings for grazing. That if your farm now is all open, if you're a pasture, you're raising cattle or sheep or whatever on pasture, and you don't have good shade, and if your pasture plants are primarily cool season pasture plants, which most of the pasture in Minnesota is cool season grasses and legumes, you're experiencing a summer slump most years. When it gets hot and it gets dry in July and August, the pasture stops growing, the nutrition starts cratering, and the livestock performance goes with it, because not only is the food that they're eating less abundant and less nutritious, it's higher in lignin, but they're also uncomfortable because it's so hot. And so the silvopasture benefits in keeping those average daily gains up in July and August on cool season grasses, because the production maintains itself in a properly designed silvopasture. You have much higher production and less of a summer slump, and the nutrition maintains itself. It doesn't get as lignified because the grasses aren't as hot as open grown. So not only is the grass more nutritious and you have more of it per acre, but the livestock are also more comfortable. They stay eating all day or most of the day instead of standing under one tree or over by the water tank and making a mess. And so particularly if you've got a slump where your livestock are not putting on gain or potentially losing weight, as we have seen from research down in Missouri. I don't know, I don't have good data for Minnesota, but I've seen systems where in the design, the open pasture cattle were losing weight, while the cattle that were in silvopasture were still gaining over a pound a day during extreme heat conditions. And at the end of 6 weeks and at the end of the year, that adds up to a lot.
Yeah.
So, there's real short-term benefit.
Sure.
And that doesn't necessarily mean you should put your whole farm into silvopasture, but a portion of it. Some recommendations suggest 25 to 30% of your farm might be in silvopasture for particularly a summer grazing system.
As a place where you can almost move in those times where you need it.
Yes, reserve it for when the heat's, when the heat is on and it's humid and the cattle are just miserable.
Sure.
You can keep those cows comfortable, and that's really important. I do grass finished beef, and keeping gain on those cattle and never letting them go backwards is extremely critical to ultimate yield and meat quality. And so it's important to think about your end product too, what you're trying to produce. And sometimes it's not as simple as just dollars and cents, but sometimes you gotta achieve certain results, and this is one way to do that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one thing that I think about here on our farm, if you look out, we're almost all corn and soybean country, flatlands, no trees. And where there is a tree, that's where all our manure gets concentrated. The cattle all stand and huddle under those trees. So in a silvopasture system, is that a worry that you have of concentrating your manure in one area or a few specific areas and not being able to evenly distribute that across your pasture?
Yeah, it's less of an issue in silvopasture, particularly because, one thing, we're going to keep the animals moving. So we're not going to park them in an area, even though if there might be enough forage for them for a week. We're going to move them and subdivide those paddocks, even within the trees. We're going to give them subdivisions for, daily moves or maybe every other day. I don't like to go beyond that. But because you've got trees, the reason the manure isn't evenly distributed across the pasture with the one tree is because the shade isn't evenly distributed across the pasture. It's in one spot, so that's where the livestock go. If the shade is much more evenly or relatively evenly distributed across the pasture, they don't necessarily pick one tree. They tend to continue moving. They keep grazing. They're under that tree, and yes, they're congregating all their manure there, but they're also not eating all day or most of the day. They usually shift their grazing behavior to grazing at night, which is fine. It's a good thing they do that, but it would be better if they, if they could continue to graze all day long and be more comfortable, lay down, chew their cud, be happy cows. So.
Well, right off the top of my head, I think of the Brix readings and the sugar content, your grass is highest in the afternoons, and that's also when the hottest weather is.
Yes.
So with that shade, you can help allow a cow to more comfortably graze when the quality of the grass is at its highest.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay. So one of my last kind of question here for you, because think we're going to have to break this into 2 podcasts. So you can touch briefly on this, and we'll get more into depth on the next one. But what are the opportunities specifically in Minnesota for farmers to implement this silvopasture system on their farms?
Yeah, I actually think Minnesota has a lot of opportunity for silvopasture. First and foremost that comes to mind is a few years ago, the University of Minnesota conducted a survey of Minnesota livestock producers and concluded that at least 600,000 acres of Minnesota woodlands are basically unmanaged grazing. That's what we call it, or minimally managed grazing. So there's an enormous opportunity there to very quickly improve the, I'd say livestock performance, the habitat performance, the environmental benefits of, water quality of that land. And that's a lot of land. And the livestock are already there. There's at least some fencing and water infrastructure there. We might need to improve some of that, and incentivize some, moving the animals around a little bit more, and maybe doing some thinning, and maybe even some tree planting in a few areas. But there's an enormous opportunity there in areas where cattle are already in the woods. In addition to that, Minnesota had, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of acres of oak savanna across the state, stretching from southeastern Minnesota all the way up to northwestern Minnesota along the sort of prairie forest border in patches and strips and pockets, all over the place. And so some of that is still there. It's just remnant savanna. It's overgrown, or been, it's being grazed now. Some of that is probably part of the, 600,000 acres of woodlands, but so that there's an opportunity there for sure, I think, to get to utilize silvopasture to restore oak savanna. And then in addition to that, we've got, I would say, red pine plantations and poplar plantations come to mind. So those are former farm fields that were planted to trees for a short rotation in the forest world, I guess. Sure. And so there's some opportunity there to, if you've got a poplar plantation that was slated to be harvested, but then, the pulp mill went out of business or burned down in the case of my area, and so you've lost that market. Now, what are you going to do with that land? Well, maybe silvopasture is a good opportunity to keep it in some trees, and you could thin that. And you could do the same with red pine. That's really actually the first, pine silvopasture is one of the first sort of, more recent in the way that we think of, modern silvopasture. The science of silvopasture was really explored and done well in the southeastern U.S. and a little bit in the northwest, but with pine plantations that, when they planted them, the markets looked good, and then 20 years later, markets didn't look so good. So they had to figure out what we're going to do to make this, how are we going to recoup our investment? What can we do here other than just cut all these trees down and start over? And that's where, silvopasture really, and a lot of research that supports the benefits that I described earlier in silvopasture came from originally. And I think that there's some opportunity, to try some of that with our own pine plantations and other sort of, timber plantations in Minnesota.
Interesting.
Additionally, one other opportunity is where we have woodlands that are probably have recently been in pretty decent shape, not grazed, not recently grazed, and we qualify as a pretty decent forest, but has since become overgrown with invasives like buckthorn. There's an opportunity to use silvopasture in the short term to set back and maybe eradicate the buckthorn, and also do some thinning and standard sort of forest improvement, timber stand improvement work inside of there, get some short-term benefits with livestock, and then shift it back into a more healthy forest system if that was something that was in alignment with the landowner's goals.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Well, thank you. Before we wrap this up, I know SFA, Sustainable Farming Association, we've got a few silvopasture field days coming up this late summer and fall. Would you mind just sharing a little more details about those, or the dates?
Absolutely.
And stuff?
Yeah, real quick. So we've got a series of 3 field days spread across the state, north, central, and southern Minnesota. We're going to have We're going to start off around 8:30, 8 o'clock, and do registration. Then we'll have about 45 minutes of sort of classroom, sort of intro to silvopasture work. Then we're going to go out and do a tour of a farm that's been utilizing silvopasture practices to do various things on their farm. Some of them are more just, converting a woodland to silvopasture. Others are really focused on, almost, pretty focused on oak savanna restoration or some variation or model of that based on the farmer's goals. And so we'll see their practices, and we'll talk about agroforestry and silvopasture, and we'll talk about some tools, and maybe utilize some tools to look at a site and go through an initial assessment, and use that to help guide sort of some initial decision making about converting particularly wooded silvopasture to a wooded area into silvopasture, I should say. And so the first one is in Becker at Snake River Farm with Tom Barthel on August 6th. And then we've got another one on August 11th at Sunup Ranch near Brainerd with Vicki Kettlewell. And then one August 13th in Wabasha with Tom Hunter. And so the one at Tom Hunter's is going to be, he's got some kind of bluff country sort of savanna he's trying to restore. And we've got some similar savanna restoration at Snake River, and Sunup Ranch up north by Brainerd's got kind of I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, they did a research sort of study up there on converting wooded area into silvopasture. So we'll take a look at that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Thanks for sharing that, and thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thanks. I should say real quick, more details and registration for those events can be found at our Silvopasture and Agroforestry page on our website at SFA, and we'll put the link in the show notes.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. And that website is sfa-mn.org. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared.
Dirt Rich is produced by the Sustainable Farming Association. We believe that agriculture, done well, heals. For more resources or to tap into the Farmer to Farmer Network, visit us at sfa-mn.org.